It was not something he wanted to do. Paulson was his patient, but he did not see that he had any other choice. The police had already been informed of the death and the circumstances surrounding it. They were satisfied themselves that their suspect was Matlow, but had asked Dr. Margrove to keep them up to date with any other developments. It was Paulson's odd behaviour that was bothering him, the fact that he suddenly seemed so calm. He had stood outside Paulson's cell and listened to him whispering to himself as well. Was Paulson deteriorating? It was 10 o'clock at night. Dr. Margrove had just finished doing his last rounds and was retiring for bed, but he suspected he wouldn't get much sleep. Meanwhile, another guard was on duty outside the padded cell. He would send for the police first thing in the morning. In the room a few doors down from the late Mr. Matlow's, Roger Swan sat on his bed and smiled. She was talking to him again. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. "Matlow has done well," the voice was saying. "He is here beside me, my right-hand man. You too could join me. Do not be afraid. Once you are with me, nothing can hurt you. You'll be free. Never again will you be locked up like an animal." Swan began to sob. "I hear you. What must I do?" "You have to show me that you are worthy. Take a piece of wood, find one of your captors, and beat him to death. Then you must take your own life in order to join me on the other side." "I will do this." "Say my name," she ordered. "Bella." "Good boy. Now go forth and do my bidding." Chapter 7. Dr. Margrove was woken by a frantic knocking on his door. He sat up quickly. The door opened. "Doctor, you need to come quickly. There's been another murder." Dr. Margrove rushed along the ground floor hallway to the patient washrooms. As he entered and saw the scene before him, he let out an involuntary gasp. There was blood everywhere. It covered a huge area of the tiled floor. The body of Nurse Shanks lay face down in the middle of it. A few feet away another body was also lying face down in an overflowing bath. "It's Swan," said Nurse Conway. His body was turned over to confirm it. "What the hell is going on around here?" whispered Dr. Margrove. The nurse shook his head. "Christ only knows. I don't think even he has the answers," replied Dr. Margrove. In the middle of the blood pool was a familiar object. "Another bed leg," said Dr. Margrove. He leaned against the wall and put his head in his hands. How could this happen? He looked up suddenly. They planned this together. Matlow and Swan. Both of them have a history of extreme violence. When they were in the activity room or eating dinner or anywhere else, did you ever see them talking together? They were always talking. They were good friends. Who else is in on this, do you think? The worst scenario? All of them. Paulson lay in his padded cell, waiting to hear her voice. It was something he looked forward to. "Hello, Matthew." Paulson smiled. "Hello, Temperance. How are you feeling this morning?" "I am well. But for me there is no morning, afternoon or evening. Time does not exist where I am. I wanted to ask you something, Matthew. What is your best memory from childhood? I know that it was difficult for you, but there must have been some moments that were good." Paulson nodded. "I once visited a stately house. It had large and beautiful grounds. There was a gardener who showed me around. He told me the name of each flower and about how unique they all were. It was a private tour. For an hour it was just me and him. I forgot about everything else, all the harshness of that bleak house." He paused. "That is my best memory. What is yours?" "The day I discovered I could speak to animals." "How can you do that?" asked Paulson. "You hear them in your head. You tune into their thoughts. I had a horse named Isabel. I used to ride her every day. I took care of her, mucked out her barn, changed her straw, fed her. I lived on an estate. My parents worked for the wealthy landowner and his wife. One evening, as I was saying good night to Isabel, I heard a voice in my mind. "Thank you for all your kindness," it said. Isabel was nuzzling me. In a sudden realization, I knew it was Isabel who was speaking to me. I was overcome at that moment by a feeling of happiness I almost cannot put into words. My horse, my Isabel, was telling me that she appreciated what I was doing for her. After that we had many conversations, and I learned that I could communicate not only with her Isabel, but with other animals on the estate. The badgers, the foxes, the owls, the deer, each had their own things to say. They would come to me of their own free will and tell me things. As I said, I was a simple girl. There were many superstitions in my day. People feared what they did not understand, so I tried to keep this gift to myself. But one afternoon, when I was talking to one of the dogs on the estate, the landowner's wife walked by. I immediately stood up, as I was required to in her presence. "What are you doing?" she asked me. "Just talking to the dog, your ladyship. He likes the sound of my voice." She scoffed and walked away, but I saw her look back with a curious stare. "Did you have any other gifts?" I could see pictures in leaves and images in the clouds. These gifts showed me things I would not have otherwise known. I knew when a storm was coming. I knew whether a baby would be a boy or a girl. I knew many things. Paulson was silent. "I wish I could do all that. It would make me special. But you are." Suddenly the door opened, and Dr. Margrove came in. He was wearing his dressing gown, and he seemed out of breath. "I am sorry to bother you at this hour, Matthew. The fact is, I owe you an apology. You can go back to your room." But the doctor looked distressed. "What is wrong, doctor?" asked Paulson. When Dr. Margrove explained, Paulson's stomach turned over. The doctor escorted Paulson back to his room. As they were walking, he said, "I am so sorry about Nurse Billings, Matthew. I know you were fond of her, and it was my decision to split you up." "I understand," replied Paulson. "But I just wanted to speak to her. You don't have to explain. Get some rest." Before they entered Ward C, Dr. Margrove paused and said, "Please do not say anything to anyone of this second tragedy. We have to contain this as much as possible for the sake of stability. If people knew what was going on, it would cause a great deal of distress for the patients. Do you promise me?" "Of course, doctor." When Dr. Margrove had left him, he went straight to the psychotic quarters. He examined Swan's room with Nurse Davis. "I just don't understand how he got out. These locks are secure. How can you open these doors from the inside?" Dr. Margrove shook his head. "I don't know. But this is the second time it's happened in the space of a few days. There's only one fairly troubling conclusion I can draw from this." "And what is that, doctor?" He turned to her. "Someone is letting them out." "But who? A member of staff?" "I can't think what else it would be." "But why? These patients are killing their colleagues. It doesn't make sense." "Life doesn't make sense a lot of the time," said Dr. Margrove, "but it still goes on." "Until it doesn't," whispered Nurse Davis. She turned away. "Doctor." "What is it?" "Look at this." Dr. Margrove came over to her and looked to where she was pointing. The bed had been shifted to one side, obviously when the leg was being wrenched off. And now something had been revealed on the floor. Written in blood was a name. "Bella," said Dr. Margrove. He looked at Nurse Davis. Matlow was writing the same name on the skirting boards, also in blood. Why this person? And what connection does she have with Swan and Matlow? Nurse Davis shook her head. "Do you think it has something to do with these deaths?" Dr. Margrove shrugged. "I have absolutely no idea. But I tell you what I want. I want to see all the patients' rooms. We'll move them into the activity room tomorrow and check each room for this name. I also want their doors examined, and I want to speak to all the patients individually. This cannot happen again." The following morning, when all the patients were in the activity room, Dr. Margrove set out with the 2 other nurses to investigate the rooms. They found 4 more with the name Bella, and all were written in blood. In each of these rooms they checked the stability of the door. There seemed to be no problems with any of them. "I want to interview these men," said Dr. Margrove. The interviews were conducted in a private room. Dr. Margrove sat on one side of the table, the patient on the other, with two male nurses in attendance. The first interviewee was a patient called Billy Rose. Mr. Rose was 38 and had been admitted to the asylum 5 years ago after attacking his mother with a poker. He smiled at the doctor. "Welcome to my humble of office, Dr. Margrove. And what can I do for you? Who is Bella?" Rose continued to smile, but he said nothing. "Would you like me to repeat the question, Billy?" "Oh, no, doctor. I heard you loud and clear." "Good. Well, then you will please answer it." "Alas, doctor, I cannot." "And why is that?" asked Dr. Margrove. "I am forbidden from doing so." "Forbidden by whom?" "Why, Bella, of course. We have an arrangement. No talking allowed." He wagged his finger at the doctor. "You are friends with Matlow and Swan, are you not?" "Oh, yes. I know them very well." "You are aware that they are dead?" "I had my suspicions," said Rose. "They killed 2 nurses between them. Do you know that?" Rose said nothing, but there was a smile on his face. "What's so funny?" asked Dr. Margrove. "Nothing." "It is clearly something. Would you like to share it with me?" "No." The next patient was Ambrose McSorley, an emaciated-looking man, but deceptively strong, with sudden outbursts of extreme violence. "Good morning, Ambrose." "Good morning, Doctor." "I am afraid I have some sad news. Matlow and Swan are dead." Dr. Margrove waited for a reaction, but he didn't get one. "Does this not bother you?" Ambrose did not respond. He stayed silent throughout the rest of the interview. They spoke to Marcus Rampling next, a small man with dark hair and a pair of beady eyes. When asked who Bella was, he began laughing. "Do you really think I'm going to tell you that, Doctor?" "I was hoping you would." Rampling leaned across the table. "Carry on hoping," he said. They got the same kind of response from the next man as well. Dr. Margrove drummed his fingers on the tabletop. "Who is Bella?" he said slowly. "Is she a real person or just imaginary? There are no nurses here of that name. Check the visitor log. See if there is anybody who has visited any of these men by the name of Bella. She has to have come from somewhere." Chapter 8. When Balfour left to go to the toilet, he walked carefully along the corridor until he came to what he was looking for. Incredibly, there was a lavatory with water still in the pan. After, when he went to wash his hands, he stared at himself in the grimy mirror. This was turning out to be a very strange evening, he thought. As a child, he used to have a recurring nightmare about being trapped in an asylum after hearing his father talking about visiting his brother in a mental hospital. He dreamed that he was running along corridors, banging on windows and doors to try and get people's attention outside, to signal that he couldn't get out. There was a clawing fear in the dream, and the feeling of being chased or stalked by somebody who was in the building with him. None of the people outside could hear or see him. The fear would always reach a climax before he finally woke up. Now here he was, running around an abandoned asylum at night. He felt somehow sorry for Margrove, this retired man who had failed, in his own eyes, to make it. He returned to him now. To his amazement and shock, he found him crying. "Anthony!" Margrove was still seated on the chair, his head in his hands. "Oh, forgive me," he said. "Not at all. Come on, let's walk and talk." They began walking back along the corridor towards the stairs. "Let's go up to the top floor," suggested Balfour. "Have a look at the psychotic wards, if they still exist." "Don't you need to be getting back?" "Well, I've got a day off tomorrow. Besides, I'm intrigued now." Margot was silent for a while. "I used to be in a place like this," he said suddenly. Balfour nodded. "When was that?" he asked quietly. "When I was in my early 20s. It's a humiliating truth, knowing that your ancestors were great psychiatrists. Did I skip the gene pool or something? Not everybody is cut out for being a doctor. You said that yourself earlier. At least you did what you could to be somehow involved. You may not have been a doctor, but you took supplies here and there, got patients from A to B. You helped out in your own way. If there weren't porters, these hospitals wouldn't run very sufficiently. Think about what your ancestor said to Paulson, that everybody brings their own strand to the tapestry of life. If there was a single strand missing, the whole thing would fall apart. You are worth as much to the medical profession as your ancestor. Don't ever think differently. Margrove nodded gently. Tell me more about your fascination with the Romans, said Balfour. Well, as I said, it was a disease that struck in childhood. Balfour laughed. I used to play with building blocks when I was very small. My father used to tell me that I would sit there and pile the bricks up to resemble great houses. He also told me that the first word I ever spoke was slave. Really? Margrove nodded. Yeah. And it wasn't even as if they'd mentioned that word and I was just mimicking it. I was playing with my building blocks. At the time when I got a little older, I started to draw slaves at work. I loved to read picture books on the Roman Empire. But why do you think you said slave? Asked Balfour. Margrove paused. I've often thought about that. Perhaps it was because I was a slave once in another life. He looked at Jamie. Is that something you believe in? Past lives? Margrove nodded. What he didn't tell Balfour was that after hearing the story about the slaves who cooked their master on his bathroom floor, he became a little obsessed. It was during the time of his incarceration, and he began drawing feverishly. He drew the scene over and over. As he drew, he would feel a surge of emotion rush through him. Anger, hatred, pain. At the time he believed it was simply a way of venting his depression. But now he wondered if there was something more to it than that. Any other hobbies? Asked Balfour. Abseiling, replied Margrove with a smile. Tell me a bit about yourself, Jamie. What do you want to know? Anything, said Margrove, wiping his eyes. I'm 33 years old. I grew up in Oxford. My parents both worked for the university, still do, although my father is about to retire. They were both very supportive of me, especially my father, who always encouraged me to do what I wanted. I used to ride horses when I was a boy. I had riding lessons every Tuesday evening between 6 o'clock and 8. I was very good. My riding teacher told me I had a connection to the horses and that they responded to that. She told me horses were very intelligent, but I gave up when I was older. Why? I wanted to do other things. But I've always liked animals. We've always had them in the family. Dogs, cats, rabbits, chickens. Chickens? Asked Margrove. We had a big garden. Sounds like you should have become a vet. I did think about it. The idea of working with animals and making them feel better was an attractive one. But then I got interested in making people better, especially people's minds. Was that because of your uncle? Asked Margrove. Balfour nodded. Yes. I met him several times when I was a boy. He always seemed perfectly okay. But then one day I witnessed him having some sort of fit, which upset me. My father explained that David was not very well, and that he had this illness that made him think there were people talking to him, among other things. I was very fond of my Uncle David, and I wanted to learn more about this illness that he had. I was 15 then, and I spent the next 4 years of my life thinking about mental illness and how it affects people. I had many long conversations with my uncle about his condition. The one thing that struck me was that he was incredibly intelligent and knew a lot of things about people in the world. A lot of these people do. Not all parts of their brain are shattered. They reached the top floor. The double doors to the old psychotic wards were no longer attached to their frame, but they were now leaning up against the wall. Up here was a series of wide corridors and empty rooms. The activity room had 60s radiators on the walls and a few dusty tables and chairs. The wind seemed louder up here. Suddenly, above the howling elements, they heard a door slam. Balfour almost jumped out of his skin. What the hell was that? Draft. This building's full of holes, and it's blowing a gale outside. This floor gives me the creeps, I won't lie. Where was Matlock's room? I'll show you, replied Margrove. They left the activity room, and Margrove showed Balfour to one of the small rooms facing onto the main corridor. This would have been his. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the storm. "So did they find out who this Bella person was?" asked Balfour. Before Margrove could answer, the distinct sound of a shrill whistle came loud and clear to their ears. They couldn't tell exactly where it had come from, but it seemed like it had been on this floor. "Was that the wind?" asked Balfour. "Probably. Anyway, to answer your question, Dr. Margrove did a search through the visitor logbook, starting with those particular patients, and then, when he had no luck there, progressing to every patient in the hospital, but with no luck. There wasn't a single mention of anyone by that name, or even close to it." Just then, the whistling sound came again. This time it came at a moment when the wind had abated. "That wasn't wind," said Balfour. "That was a proper whistle. Is there anyone else in the building with us?" Margrove frowned, shaking his head. "Unless there are squatters." Balfour left the room and made his way out into the corridor. He shone his torch into the darkness. "Hello?" he called. Nothing. "It's an old building, Jamie," said Margrove, joining him in the corridor. "It makes all sorts of noises." Chapter 9. Dr. Margrove was talking to the nurses who were on duty the night Swan murdered Nurse Shanks. "You were both on duty tonight. What happened?" James Conroy sighed and looked at his colleague, Violet Fisher. "Tell him," she said. "Tell me what?" said Dr. Margrove. "I was doing my rounds as usual," said Conroy, with another sigh. "I suddenly looked through a window and saw someone on the grounds. They were running in the direction of the woodshed. I immediately thought it could be an intruder, so I went to the office to use the speaking tube to alert someone downstairs, but nobody replied. I told Nurse Fisher to stay up here while I go down." "You left Nurse Fisher up here on her own?" quizzed Dr. Margrove. "Yes, sir," replied Conroy in a very quiet voice. "At least 2 nurses are supposed to be up here at all times, not 1. You know that." "Yes, doctor, I know that." "And what happened after that?" "We went looking on the grounds, but couldn't find whoever it was." "Why is this the first time I'm hearing about this incident?" Conroy didn't reply. "I'm waiting," said Dr. Margrove. "Because I messed up, sir." "Yes, you did, and a patient escaped. At the same time, Doctor, I don't see how that is my fault. They were all locked in." "Well, that's what I'm trying to understand. Nurse Fisher, have you got anything to add?" "I felt very dizzy at one point and had to go to the office to sit down. I was there for maybe 5 minutes." "Maybe 5 minutes," he repeated. "And in that time, Swan somehow manages to get through a locked door?" "Yes, doctor." Dr. Margrove stared hard at her. "Through a locked door?" Nurse Fisher shrugged. Dr. Margrove was silent for a moment. "Nurse Conroy, you can go. Nurse Fisher, you stay here." Conroy rose to his feet. "I'm sorry, doctor." Dr. Margrove nodded, but said nothing. After Conroy had left, Nurse Fisher said, "Do you not believe what I've told you?" "Nurse Fisher, these men are cunning, but none of them could open a door that is locked with a bolt from the other side of it. Somehow, someone had to let them out." "Are you suggesting—" "I did a check of the rotas. You were also on duty the night Matlow escaped. Now, is that merely an unfortunate coincidence, Nurse Fisher, or is something a little more worse?" "Are you accusing me of deliberately letting these men out? For the purpose of what? So they can hurt my colleagues? How dare you?" "Perhaps I'm wrong, but the evidence is there. Someone let them out of their rooms, and you are the common denominator." "So is this Bella, whoever the hell she is. I am a professional nurse, and I take my job very seriously, and to do it the best of my ability. So I resent the idea that I had anything to do with this." Nurse Fisher was shaking with emotion. Dr. Margrove sighed. "I have 4 dead people here, Violet, and so far I have nothing but a blood-scrawled name. I am clutching at straws here." "Well then, may I suggest, Doctor, that you keep an eye on things up here yourself, because neither myself or my colleagues want to be accused of conspiracy to murder." It was 9 o'clock on Sunday night. Paulson was alone in the chapel. He sat in the middle of a pew. His head was down, his eyes closed. By all appearances he was praying, but he wasn't. Instead he was listening to the voice that was whispering in his ear. "Matthew, can you hear me?" Paulson nodded, but said nothing. "There are things I need to tell you, but they are troubling things. Only here in this house of God do I have the energy to relate them to you. As I said, I was a simple servant girl with a gift. All I ever wanted to be was good, and all I ever wanted to do was kindness. But there are people in this world, as you know, that choose the opposite path, the path of darkness. To fight darkness, you must smother it with light. I am that light. That is my goal. It has been for 500 years. Listen to me carefully, Matthew, for I need your help." Dr. Margrove sat on a chair in the corridor of the psychotic ward and squared his back against it. He had a long night ahead of him. He was going to sit here until the morning. This corridor had a good view of the rooms that McSorley and Rampling occupied. Along the next corridor were the rooms where Rose and the other patient Stockton resided. He would do routine checks on them every half an hour. If they did get out, they would have to come right past him to escape from the ward itself, if that was their intention. Nurse Fisher was not on duty tonight. It was 2 male nurses. An hour ticked by. Dr. Margrove wandered around, checking on the nurses in the rooms. He would peer through the peephole at the patients to see what they were up to. But so far, they were all in bed. So too was Paulson. But he wasn't asleep. He was going over in his head what Temperance had said to him in the chapel. I knew the wife of the landlord did not like me. She looked down on me like dirt under her feet. She was, however, highly respected and regarded in the community, a pillar of grace. One night I had gone to check on Isabel, for she seemed restless. As I was crossing the yard, I saw the light from a lantern far off in the field. The light disappeared into the woods on the other side. I thought nothing about it and went to see Isabel. She was uptight, stamping her hooves and whinnying. I asked her what was wrong. "There is wickedness in the air tonight," she said. "A bad energy lies over the woods. I fear it." I managed to comfort her, but the whole time I kept thinking about the person who I'd seen with the lantern. When I had left Isabel, I stole across the field and into the wood. As I walked deeper in, I could see the light from many lanterns, and a slow chanting came to my ears. I moved closer to have a look. What I saw was a group of people all gathered around something in the middle of a circle. I could not tell immediately what it was, for it was in shadow. At last, though, enough light spilled across it for me to see that it was a child. It looked to be asleep, but I knew it was not. Crouched next to the child was a dark figure that blended into the night. When it rose, it cast back its hood, and I saw the wife of the landlord. In her hand I saw the glint of a dagger. I knew it was witchcraft, and that the child in the middle of the circle was a sacrifice. I did not know what to do. I ran back across the field and hid in the barn. I lay down next to Isabel in the straw and shook with fear. I must have fallen asleep. How, I don't know. But when I woke up, someone was standing over me. It was the wife of the landlord. "I know you saw me," she said. "I do not know what you're talking about, ma'am," I replied. "I think you do. And I will tell you only this once. You know my secret, yes, but I know yours. I know you have powers of your own. Trust me when I tell you they will believe me before they believe you. So unless you want to burn, I would keep quiet if I were you." I did keep quiet, but I did not have the chance to be quiet for long. 2 days later, men from the law came and took me away. I was accused of being a witch. They tortured me for days, until I was forced to confess. But I told them about the landlord's wife as well. They did not believe me, accusing me of killing the child and blaming it on her. I was charged and sentenced to death by being burned at the stake, so that the flames would purify my soul and drive the devil from it. They executed me the following night. My family were the only ones who stood by me. They were evicted by the landlord and cast adrift to find their own way. 2 weeks later, as I watched from a higher plane, my father and a group of men abducted the landlord's wife and murdered her, throwing her body down a well. It was never found, and has lain there ever since. But her soul is not finished. The evil in her continues to want to kill. She is seeking other souls to join her circle. She wants also to seek revenge on what was done to her by my father and his men. I tried to stop her once, but I was not strong enough. I cannot properly rest until I have put an end to her evil. Who was she? Asked Paulson. Her name was Arabella, but her husband referred to her always as Bella. How can I help you, Temperance? Bella is here, Matthew. She is the one responsible for the murders. The asylum has allowed her to continue her work through the disturbed minds of the inmates. She can communicate with them. They can hear her, and she manipulates them for her own gains. I need to stop her. I need to expose her as the witch that she is. But I cannot do that alone. I cannot get near her energy. It is too strong. You have the same light in you that I have. If I attach myself to you, I can overpower her. Dr. Margrove jolted himself upright in the chair. He had dozed off for God knew how long. He looked at his pocket watch. He had been asleep for half an hour. He cursed inwardly and rubbed his face. Suddenly he heard a whistle. He looked up. Where had that come from? He stood up out of his chair and began walking along the corridor. He checked on McSorley and Rampling. They were still asleep. The whistle came again, just as he was pulling away from Rampling's door. It was not someone whistling a tune. It sounded more like somebody calling a dog or trying to get another person's attention. He walked into the other corridor and found one of the nurses. "What is it?" asked Dr. Margrove. "Sorry, doctor," replied the nurse. "Did you whistle on me?" The nurse frowned and shook his head. "No." "Who's whistling?" "I can't hear anything, doctor." Dr. Margrove nodded. "Everything in order?" "Everything, doctor." "All right. I think I'll make myself some tea." He entered the nurse's office, where there was a stove and a little kettle. He began brewing himself some tea. As he stood in the silence, waiting for the water to boil, he once again heard the whistle. He turned. It had come from just outside the office door. He ran out into the corridor. There was no one around. As he turned to go back in, he stopped dead. At the end of the corridor, where the shadows were deeper, a figure could be seen standing there. It was swathed in what looked like a black gown, with a pale face staring out from it. In the next second it seemed to tug itself back into the shadows and disappear. The hairs went up on the back of Dr. Margrove's neck. He stood there for a moment, still staring towards the spot. He realized he was breathing heavily. Suddenly he snapped into action. He grabbed an oil lamp from the table in the office and ran back out into the hallway. He walked briskly towards the end, where he had seen the apparition, and shone the light around him. The corridor was a dead end, with no doors leading off it. Whoever it was had vanished. "Why is she here? Why are you here?" The asylum and its grounds were built over the site of my death, and Bella's. I died where the blacksmith's hovel is today. Only meters away is where Bella's body was thrown down the well. It lies beneath the mortuary building. You have to tell Dr. Margrove about Bella. All I need to do is stop the next murder, and I will be free. Do you understand, Matthew? "Yes," said Paulson. "I understand that I need to put you and I between the next violent inmate that tries to kill a nurse. I do not want to put you in harm's way, Matthew, but I know no other way of doing it. I am scared, Matthew, scared of the outcome. We must keep each other strong. I will do whatever I can to help you, Temperance. You are my friend." Chapter 10. Extract from Dr. Margrove's medical notes. Interview with patient today was very interesting, if a little worrying. He immediately began to tell me he knew who Bella was. I asked him how he knew that name. "I was told it by someone," he replied. "By who, Matthew? Who were you told it by?" "Temperance told me," he said. He then proceeded to tell me that Temperance was a spirit. "Like a ghost?" I said. "Yes, doctor. He told me that Bella was responsible for the murders, that she was a witch, and that she could speak to the inmates, ordering them to kill. I then asked him how he heard Temperance, whether it was in his head or as he hears me. "Like hearing you," he replied. He said she needed to latch onto him, that Paulson had to be there to stop the next murder. I did not fully understand, but I am now exceedingly concerned about Paulson's well-being. He is hearing voices. It is only psychotic patients who hear voices. I will have to keep an eye on this and talk more about it with him." Paulson was walking on the grounds. "I don't think he believed me, Temperance." "Then we have to convince him." "How?" "He has seen her. She has shown herself to him. But he has not spoken of this to anyone. Do you know when she will strike again, or who is next her victim?" "No, I do not." McSorley was working on a painting in the activity room. The colours were beautiful, greens, blues, yellows. He was doing an imaginary landscape. "Hello, Ambrose." Her voice was seductive. He smiled. "What are you painting?" "A landscape." "Paint me instead," she said. "But I want to finish this." "Are you arguing with me, Ambrose?" "You know what will happen if you argue with me." "Sorry, Bella." "I forgive you." "Now paint me." Rampling was building a stack of cards. He was aiming to build it as high as he could, using the entire pack. He was almost there, but it had taken him half an hour. "Knock it down," said the voice. "But I am nearly there." "Knock it down." Rampling did as he was told. "Good boy. Now start again." Rampling began gathering up the cards. "How irritating it is to have to start all over again before you are finished. I had nearly finished something when I was murdered. Now I have to start again. Sacrifices were the key to what I was doing. I was summoning him from the fiery bowels of the earth. I was inviting him to rise up before me in all his greatness. But the devil does not just show himself to anyone. I had to show him that I was worthy of this presence. In order to do that, I had to sacrifice 100 souls for him. I had reached 65. I was almost there, and then she ruined it all. That pathetic little wench. And now he tells me I have to start again from the beginning, no matter how long that takes. But I have risen to that challenge. There are plenty of souls here to choose from. Perhaps it will not take so long after all, provided nobody gets in my way." She laughed. "And nobody will." Later that night, Nurse Fisher was back on duty, and Dr. Margrove was back on his watch. He stayed focused for several hours, but eventually he fell asleep. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he got a male nurse to relieve him. "Try and stay alert," he told him. "Yes, doctor." "I want you to report back to me at 7. "Understood." The male nurse positioned himself in a stiff pose. He rolled his neck and took a deep breath in. Meters away from where he sat, Rampling was lying in bed, blinking at the darkness. "We have a slight problem," said Bella. "What is that?" whispered Rampling. "She is planning to stop me." "Who?" "Temperance, the little farm girl who tried to intervene before." Bella laughed dryly. "She was too weak to stop me then, but I am concerned that her strength has increased." "How do you know she is here?" "I feel her energies. She has lain quiet for centuries, but now I feel her beginning to stir." "What can we do?" "I exposed her once. I will do it again." Dr. Margrove was walking through the activity room and general population the next morning, speaking to the patients. "Doctor, I must tell you something," said Arnold Reardon. He looked and sounded agitated. "What is it, Arnold? Do you want to go somewhere quieter to talk?" Reardon nodded, trembling. They left the activity room and stood in the corridor. "What's wrong, Arnold?" "I had a dream last night. A very disturbing dream." "Go on," said Dr. Margrove gently. "There was a woman in my dream. She told me she was a witch." Dr. Margrove frowned. "I know it sounds strange, but I did dream it. She said she wanted to kill people." "What was her name? Do you know that?" "Temperance." Dr. Margrove's face blanched. "Thank you, Arnold. But I wouldn't worry. It was just a dream." Paulson was sitting writing when Margrove came up to him. "Could I have a word?" Paulson smiled. "Of course, Doctor." Dr. Margrove crouched down next to him and kept his voice low. "Have you been speaking to Arnold recently?" "Who?" "Arnold Reardon. He sleeps in Ward C with you." "Oh, yes, I have spoken to him. A nice man." "Have you discussed with him what you told me the other day?" "Definitely not. That is between you and me." "Why do you ask?" "Because he seems to know about temperance as well." Dr. Margrove cleared his throat. "Reardon is very open to suggestion. If you tell him things, he will often get upset about them." "I have not told him anything, Doctor, I promise." Dr. Margrove sighed. "According to you, Bella is a witch. But Reardon tells me that Temperance is a witch too." "She is not a witch. She just possesses certain powers." "He also says that she came to him in a dream and told him she wants to kill people." "What do you say to that?" "I don't understand," replied Paulson, frowning. "Well, that makes two of us." 2 days later, Dr. Margrove was saying grace before lunch with the psychotic patients when Rampling interrupted him by jumping up and saying, "We are all doomed!" Dr. Margrove looked up, mid-speech. "Why do you say that?" "Temperance is here." Dr. Margrove stiffened. "Who?" "Temperance. She is evil." Rampling was calmed by a nurse, and Dr. Margrove finished this grace. All throughout the lunch, Dr. Margrove's mind was racing. When lunch was over, he went to his study and wrote in his diary, "What is happening here? Who are these unearthly inhabitants of my asylum? First Bella and now Temperance? Is it all just one big shared hallucination that is causing violent hysteria?" Chapter 11. The blacksmith's hovel thronged with the sound of hammering as snow began to fall on the asylum grounds. Jerry, the blacksmith, was showing a group of patients how to make horseshoes. Among those patients was Rampling, who was being supervised by 2 male nurses. After his outbreak at the lunch table, Dr. Margrove was trying to find something to take his mind off his worries. At the same time, Paulson was in the cowshed, feeding the heifers. Temperance came to him there. "There is a storm coming. I can feel it. I can feel Bella too. She is gaining power, and she can feel me as well. She senses I am a threat and is seeking to expose me, just like she did the first time. She told the law that I was a witch in order to get rid of me. She couldn't have me around to foil her plans." In the blacksmith's hovel, the coals burned red over the fire. Rampling stood right next to it, the heat from the flames making his face turn rosy. "You know what to do," said the voice. Rampling now began to shake. "I cannot," he whispered. "That is not a word I can accept, Rampling. Do as I tell you, now." He shook his head. His breathing started to increase. "Rampling, are you okay?" asked one of the male nurses. "I need to get out of here." "Why?" "Just let me out of here." "All right." They began escorting him to the door. "You do not refuse me," screamed Bella. "I don't want to talk to you anymore, Bella. Go away." "Calm down," said one of the nurses. "You don't need to speak to anyone if you don't want to." "That's right, and I will not speak to her anymore." They reached the door. When the nurses tried to open it, they found they couldn't. "What's wrong?" asked a colleague. "I can't open it." He tried again. "It's stuck fast." "You won't get out," she whispered. "Nobody will get out alive." "Bella, don't do this," shouted Rampling. "I will show you what happens to deserters," she hissed. "Watch this." The flames and the fire suddenly began to increase their intensity. Before they knew it, it was out of control. Like a living thing, it rose higher and higher. Rampling heard Bella again. She was singing a lullaby. Sweet dreams. And then the flames exploded outwards. Paulson heard the bang. It sent a shockwave through the cowshed. What the hell was that? He heard Temperance's despairing voice. It was Bella. Paulson rushed out of the barn to see the blacksmith's hovel ablaze. He ran as fast as he could through the snow towards it. No! He screamed. The walls disintegrated as he watched. There was nothing he could do. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, and then he saw it, a figure dressed in a black gown, standing in the middle of the flames. At that point people came running with black buckets of water. There were shouts of alarm and distress. The water seemed to evaporate in plumes of steam as it hit the inferno. Paulson was suddenly rooted to the spot. The figure was still there, motionless, staring at him as the flames danced around it. Paulson felt a chill. It was not a physical chill from the cold snow. It came from within him. It emanated from his soul. Dr. Margrove stood before the charred, smoking remains of the blacksmith's hovel and watched the bodies being carried out on makeshift stretchers and laid in the snow. Paulson was also lying in the snow. He had not the energy to get up. He stared at the grey sky above him. His skin and clothes were covered in soot. The tears he had cried had frozen in the ice around him. His hand suddenly came into contact with something sharp in the snow. He pulled it out. It was a thorn branch. He looked around him. There was a thorn tree nearby. "Are you there, Temperance?" he whispered. "I am here, sweetheart. This world is like a thorn tree, ugly and painful. But it is nature, and nature is also beautiful. We are beautiful, you and I. The ugly parts are souls like Bella." Paulson shook his head, fresh tears running down his face. "I am ugly. That is why I am shut in here. I am the thorn in the side of decent society. People who were born to lovely parents, whose parents are proud of them. My father was not proud of me. I am a failure in life. I couldn't save these people. I couldn't save Nurse Billings." Paulson began to sob violently. "I can't do anything. I want to die." "Shh," whispered Temperance soothingly. "You are a good man, Matthew. And good men are powerful men, whether they know it or not. Have faith in who you are, Matthew. Have faith in your strength." "Dr. Margrove!" shouted one of the male nurses. "Over here!" Dr. Margrove approached the nurse who had called him over to one of the remains. The man was half naked, the clothes having been burned off him. With a shaking hand the nurse pointed to a section of exposed torso. When Dr. Margrove saw what he was pointing at, he turned instantly and threw up. He crouched on all fours for a moment to regain his composure. Then he turned back to the body. Burnt into the man's flesh was one name: Temperance. "This whole place is now in lockdown," he said. "Put all the general population patients in their wards and keep them there," said Dr. Margrove, walking swiftly along the corridor. "Make sure all the psychotics are in their rooms and put nurses on guard at each door. Call in the police. Tell them we have an emergency situation here at the asylum and I need help to contain it. Do that now." Nurse Schroeder broke off from him and hurried off to do as he was told. "Put Paulson in a padded cell. Tell him it's for his own protection." "Why? Just do it." Sergeant Gottfried, who had attended after the murder of Nurse Billings, arrived an hour later, with a 20-strong group of officers with helmets and truncheons. "Thank you for coming," said Dr. Margrove. He explained what had been happening since he last arrived. "I didn't tell you about the second murder for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I was doing my own investigation, and secondly, because I wanted to keep the situation under control. I have 85 patients in here, Sergeant, and I have to keep things calm. But this is now way out of control. I have issued a state of lockdown for matters of safety. I need your help to control this situation." "Understood, Doctor." The The patients and general population were herded into their wards, as Dr. Margrove had ordered. 2 nurses were placed in each ward with them, and 2 officers were posted outside every one of them. Paulson was escorted by 2 male nurses to the same padded cell where he had been placed before. "What have I done? Why are you placing me in here?" "It's for your own protection, Matthew. We have a lockdown situation." As the door was closed on him, Paulson stared through the bars at the nurses. "These are Dr. Margrove's orders, Matthew. I'm sorry." Dr. Margrove, meanwhile, was on the top floor with the rest of the officers and the sergeant. "There are 3 patients here that are particularly dangerous. The other patients managed to somehow get out of their locked rooms. Don't ask me how, because I don't know. I want 5 officers posted outside the main door. The rest of the officers I want posted in the corridors here. Perhaps 2 more in front of the main doors. The others can be split up to guard the 3 patients and keep an eye on the rest of this level. Do you understand?" "Yes, Doctor," replied Gottfried. "What can I do to help?" "You're helping me already." "Who do you think is responsible for all this?" asked Gottfried. Dr. Margrove paused. He thought about everything he knew already. "Why don't we talk about that later on, Sergeant?" he said. Snow continued to fall. It swirled around the buildings as if trying to find a way in. By evening it had turned into a blizzard. The officers patrolled the top level with their truncheons, and the nurses sat with the neurosis patients in their wards, staring out the window at the storm. Some of them were now becoming anxious. "What is happening?" one asked a nurse. "It is nothing to worry about. Try to sleep." "I do not like the storm," said another. "The building might collapse in the wind, and then we shall all die." "The building is not going to collapse." In another ward on the first floor, things were a little worse. 2 patients had got into an argument over a rug that had been taken off one of the beds. "That's mine, give it back! I'm colder than you are. Find another rug then." One of the nurses tried to intervene. "Sam, just let him have this rug back. We'll get you another one." "No, I want this one." "But it isn't yours." "Well, I used to sleep on that bed." The door opened, and one of the officers stuck his head in. "Everything all right?" "Yes, thank you," said the nurse. Dr. Margrove sat with Sergeant Gottfried in the activity room on the top floor. It was 8:15. "You asked me earlier who I thought was responsible for all this." Gottfried nodded. He paused. "I cannot explain what is happening here, Sergeant. I don't think many other people could claim to either. Something is very wrong. These patients, the ones who have committed these appalling acts, seem to be following orders from some kind of entity." "Say that again, Doctor?" Dr. Margrove scratched his cheek. "An entity that calls itself Bella." "Wait a minute. You, a doctor of mental illness, are telling me these patients are hearing ghostly voices and are killing people as a result?" "Yes, I would usually have said that they were suffering from a psychotic episode. They were psychotic patients, but evidence suggests that this might not be the case." Sergeant Gottfried shook his head. "Don't let anybody else hear you talk like that, Doctor. You will lose all credibility." Dr. Margrove nodded. "Fair enough." He stood up. "You know, I have worked here for 10 years. I have helped many patients overcome some very difficult traumas and issues in their lives, and I have done this with dignity and respect for their person. Not many asylums could claim to have done this. I follow the doctrine of moral treatment, Sergeant. I do not chain these people up in basements and beat them senseless to drive the evil spirits from them." He paused again. "But perhaps that's what I will be forced to do now, because there is something supernatural going on here. Then why do you think I can help the situation, Doctor? I can't arrest a ghost. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to help stop these possessed patients from killing my staff and themselves. I can't do anything about the ghost, if that's what she is, but several police officers can overpower a psychotic patient, no matter how determined he is. That's why I need you here." Paulson sat huddled in the corner of his padded cell, a place he was becoming very used to by now. "I am scared, Temperance," he whispered. "It is okay to be scared. Fear is a healthy emotion sometimes, although it is not a pleasant emotion. I felt it when they arrested me, when they tortured me. I felt it when they were taking me to the stake. It was a dark night. The sky was clear and covered in stars. I sat in a cart, clinging to the bars that imprisoned me. The road was lined with people. They threw things at me through the bars and shouted abuse. At one stage we passed a man and his dog, a great Irish wolfhound. It stared intently at me, its eyes full of dissupport. "Be brave," he told me. "Do not let them see your fear. Be brave," he said again. "It will all be over soon." I saw the stake up ahead and the soldiers piling wood around its base. The torches were already lit. At that moment, somebody jumped onto the cart and clung onto the bars. It was Tobias, a good friend of mine. He worked as a servant up at the main house. He put his hand through the bars and grabbed mine. I wanted to hold him so much. I wanted him to take me away, to save me. But he couldn't. He was dragged back into the crowd by the two soldiers, and that was the last time I saw him. I felt the fear rise in me then, tenfold. My limbs trembled. Tears began to run down my face. They stopped the cart and pulled me out. I did not want to go. I fought them, kicking and screaming, pleading for my life, but it had no effect on my executioners. I was dragged across the ground towards the spot where I was going to burn. I was terrified of the very thought of being burned alive. At one point I remember vomiting into the grass. They dragged me right through it. I was pinned to the stake. Thick ropes were wrapped around me, securing my whole body. They started to cover me in tar so that I would catch fire quicker. My heart was beating to a rhyme I had never felt before. The priest stood before me with his cross. "Ye shall now burn in the fire that is sent from heaven to cleanse your soul of the devil and all his evil ways. May God have mercy upon you." As he raised his crucifix, the soldiers stepped forward with the lighted torches and lit the dry wooden sticks beneath me. I screamed then in absolute terror, knowing that in a few seconds I would be engulfed in searing hot fire. I felt the heat as the sticks exploded into flames. I raised my eyes to the starry sky. The sparks from the fire rose up as if to join them. And then, as the wolfhound had said, it was all over. I found myself standing on the road. The crowds had all gone. Everything was silent. Paulson felt tears in his eyes. "I am sorry, Temperance." He sighed. "I am sorry. That is why I want to stop her so much. I curse her for what she put me through that night. I have never forgotten it. The experience of burning at that stake was infused into my soul. The fear, the pain, the anguish, and the injustice of it all." Paulson's tears overflowed. I remember standing before my father in the kitchen of our house one afternoon. He had a metal poker in his hand, which he had taken from the stove. It had been sitting there for half an hour. He rushed to me then and grabbed me by the scruff. He tore the shirt off and pressed the red-hot metal onto my skin. I screamed with the pain. He burnt me again, holding the poker there for several seconds. I passed out then. When I came back to consciousness, I was lying on my bed. I was in so much pain that I could hardly move. I lay there and sobbed until the morning. I know I did nothing. I know I did not suffer pain like you did, Temperance, but I know a little of what you experienced, and I know what injustice feels like a bitter taste left over from something you have eaten, except that it stays with you for longer. I did nothing to deserve what my father did to me. Yourself and Dr. Margrove have shown me that now. I am a good man. I know I owe to Dr. Margrove to get better, and live my life in a more positive way. Paulson looked up. But I am still scared. Sergeant Godfrey had convinced Dr. Margrove to get at least a little bit of sleep. He and his men would keep an eye on things. Dr. Margrove had reluctantly taken himself off to his study for a couple of hours' rest, but his dreams were disturbing. When he woke up, he glanced at his pocket watch. It was 12:30. He roused himself and went to check on the neurotic patients. Most of them were now asleep as well. He went to Paulson's cell. He opened the door gently. "Hello, Matthew. How are you?" "Afraid," he replied, looking up at the doctor. Dr. Margrove crouched down in front of him. "I know. We are all afraid." "I put you in here for your own safety, Matthew." "No, you didn't. You put me in here because you don't entirely trust me, after what I told you. You think I'm going to attack someone as well, because I'm hearing voices. Dr. Margrove hesitated a moment. Then he lowered his head. It's all right. I understand. But I am not about to kill anyone. You saw her. Dr. Margrove looked up. What? In the corridor, dressed in black. I saw her too, in the flames. Dr. Margrove stared at him. How? Temperance told me. Again, Dr. Margrove stared at him without speaking. Let me help you, Doctor. Please, let me help you. You have helped me. But what can you really do, Matthew? Paulson didn't reply. Stay here for just now. Be safe. Is there anything I can get you for you? A blanket would be nice, and some writing materials.